hosts and then eventually involving all of you. Please feel free to move up to the tables. The Ratiu Award has always been designed as a workshop, as a conversation, and so that's why we do it in this conference room, not upstairs in the auditorium, where having a dialogue is somewhat more difficult and awkward. We have Manuel will be joined by three distinguished experts. You have their bios in front of you, so I will not introduce them in detail, but we have Carl Gershman, the president, of course, of the National Endowment for Democracy, Ambassador Roger Noriega, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, as well as Professor Richard Feinberg, professor of international political economy at the University of California, San Diego. I think we'll start with Carl Gershman, then turn to the ambassador, then Professor Feinberg, and then give Manuel a chance to respond to any of the questions and comments and presentations, and then open it up for a discussion with all of you until about 5 o'clock. So
this is on.
It's on.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and with my dear friend Manuel. Fidel Castro, who died on November 25th, was a political tyrant who succeeded in convincing many people in the democratic world that he was actually the very opposite. The Prime Minister of Canada called him a legendary revolutionary. To the leader of the British Labour Party, he was a champion of social justice, while the President of Ireland called him a giant among global leaders, whose view was not only one of freedom for his people, but for all of the oppressed and excluded peoples on the planet. Castro was able to fool so many people because he was a skillful demagogue who knew how to manipulate emotions and political prejudices to secure his power and magnify his public image. How he was able to do that and why democratic countries have produced so many useful idiots, which is how Lenin described Western apologists for communism, are questions that have been dealt with elsewhere. It is also not my intention to respond to the lies and propaganda about Castro, which is a fruitless exercise that only dignifies ideas that don't deserve to be taken seriously. Rather than speaking about Castro, I think it's far better to remember people who heroically resisted his ruthless demagogy and to let their stories elucidate his ignominious legacy. I want to speak about four such heroes. The first is Pedro Luis Boitel, who has been called the emblematic figure of the Cuban pro-democracy movement. Boitel was active in the 1950s against the Batista dictatorship until he was forced into exile in Venezuela, where he set up a radio station that broadcast anti-Batista messages to Cuba. He returned to Cuba after the revolution and ran for the presidency of the university students as the candidate of Castro's 26th of July movement. But Castro supported a rival candidate, already viewing Boitel as a potential threat because he was charismatic, an opponent of communism, and had strong backing from the labor movement. When Castro's totalitarian intentions became clear, Boitel founded the Movement for the Recovery of the Revolution. In short order, he was arrested and condemned to 10 years in prison. It was in Castro's prisons that Boitel underwent a profound spiritual transformation. He rallied prisoners around a philosophy of unyielding, nonviolent resistance to the regime, one that accepted no type of compromise with his jailers. He was the first of the plantados, the immovable ones in prison who endured the harshest punishment. Boitel began a series of hunger strikes and other protests as a way of defending his dignity and that of his fellow prisoners. The regime kept him in prison beyond his 10-year term, and on April the 3rd, 1972, he began one last hunger strike to protest this and other issues. According to fellow prisoners, when Boitel died 53 days later, it was not from the hunger strike, but from being smothered with a pillow by one of the security officers. Because of his moral leadership and uncompromising resistance to the regime, and not least because of his mother's persistence in making his case known to the world, Boitel soon became an icon of the anti-Castro struggle. Though he was buried in an unmarked grave, his legend lived on by word of mouth in Cuba's streets and especially in the prisons. The pro-democracy activist soon found his grave, and there is now every year a clash with police when activists make a pilgrimage to the gravesite to remember Boitel and his struggle. And today many dissident groups in Cuba name themselves after Boitel. Uber Matos is a second hero who was also opposed to Batista, but unlike Boitel, he was part of the military effort to overthrow the dictatorship. He famously flew a 5-ton air cargo of weapons to the rebels, led the assault on Santiago de Cuba, and rode into Havana atop a tank alongside Castro and other revolutionaries in the Victory Parade in January 1959. He was appointed commander of the army in the province of Camagüey. Like Boitel, Matos soon became disaffected by Castro's first moves to impose a totalitarian system, including the execution by firing squads of hundreds of prisoners at the La Cabaña fortress and the establishment of Cuba's first forced labor camp, Guanahacibibes, that set the pattern for jailing dissidents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-Cubans, priests, and others. This repression has been documented by Nestor Almendros in his moving film, Improper Conduct. He resigned his position on October 19th and was immediately arrested, along with 5 captains and 11 lieutenants who protested his arrest. At his trial, at Matos's trial, Castro delivered a 7-hour harangue accusing Matos of campaigning against the revolution and promoting the interests of the United States, large landowners, and supporters of Batista. Matos was sentenced to 20 years in prison, 16 of which he spent in solitary confinement. He was tortured, engaged in hunger strikes, and was constantly told that he would never get out alive. But he was released in 1979, in part because of an appeal signed by 100 of the most prominent Americans, among them Senators Henry Scoop Jackson, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Nobel laureate Saul Bellow, Arthur Schlesinger, and others. At a press conference in New York just weeks after his release, Matos issued a powerful statement affirming that his belief that the Cuban struggle for freedom would succeed. The struggle against the regime will be a long one, he said. Of that, we have no illusions. But it will succeed because of the people's commitment to basic democratic values. He called for an ideological struggle against Castro to explain the hard truth about his rule, which is that his regime violates every norm of freedom and well-being and is despised by the overwhelming majority of the Cuban people. And the following year, he set up in Caracas an organization called Cuba Independiente y Democrática, which remains active today, supporting the development of a strong civil society across the island. And Matos died in exile in Miami 2 years ago. The third hero is Laura Payan, the founder of the Damas de Blanco, or Ladies in White. She was a simple woman, a mother, a housewife, a teacher, someone who loved literature. She was not political, at least until her husband, Hector Maceda Gutierrez, was arrested along with 74 other dissidents in the Black Spring of 2003. From the moment he was taken away, she had a mission to free her husband and to rally other women whose loved ones had also disappeared. And toward that end, she formed the Damas de Blanco. They marched every week from the Church of Santa Rita, dressed in white and carrying gladioli. The garments symbolized the purity of their motives, and the flowers their integrity and moral strength. And when they chanted Libertad, they did so not just for their husbands and fathers and sons and brothers, but for Cuba itself. The regime reacted to their peaceful marches with violence and venom. The women were insulted, called traitors and mercenaries, and attacked by shock mobs. But they persisted, and as they did, their reputation and moral authority grew in Cuba and throughout the world. Then on September 24th, 2011, when the women were being shoved and beaten by one of these mobs, Laura was personally attacked by an agent of the state security. She fell into critical condition just 8 days later and died on October the 14th, a martyr in the cause of freedom. Was Laura Payan assassinated? Her successor, Berta Soler, believes that she was. She told me so earlier this year. And so does the Cuban musician Amari Gutierrez, whose beautiful hymn, Remembering Laura Payan, had these words in it. The evil of your executioner made you eternal. The homeland thanks you and worships you. They wanted to silence you, and your voice today and your voice today sounds ever so high. Dictators, murderers of women, justice has not arrived, but it is coming. It's been more than 50 years, but we continue on fighting. Laura, brave woman. While people throughout Cuba mourned the death of Laura Payan, the government responded with infinite ideological rancor, in the words of Yoani Sanchez. Laura is gone, she continued, and now all the acts of hatred against her resonate even more grotesquely. Laura is gone, and we are left with a country slowly waking up from a very old totalitarianism that doesn't even know how to say I'm sorry. The last hero I want to speak about today is Osvaldo Paya, who was one of the most prominent opponents of the Cuban dictatorship. Paya was a Catholic activist who founded the Christian Liberation Movement in 1988 and is best known for the Varela Project, a petition drive he launched in 2002 calling for free elections and other rights. The project angered the Cuban government, which responded by forcing through the National Assembly a constitutional amendment making the communist system in Cuba irrevocable. This was followed by the Black Spring, when it arrested 75 of the most prominent Cuban activists. It did not, however, arrest Paya only because of the international renown that he had achieved. The European Parliament had awarded him its Sakharov Prize in 2002, and that same year he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by hundreds of parliamentarians in a campaign led by his friend, the Czech President Václav Havel. Unlike Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma and Liu Xiaobo of China, for whom Havel also campaigned, Paya never received the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was an activist in the same mold, committed to nonviolence and reconciliation, and a moral leader of world renown. Paya met a fate similar to that which befell Laura Payan. He was killed under mysterious circumstances. On July 22, 2012, he died in an automobile crash when he was traveling in a rented car with 3 fellow Christian Democrats, 2 of them from Europe, to meet with supporters of the Christian Liberation Movement in the eastern end of the island. The Cuban regime sentenced the Spanish driver, Angel Caramero, to 4 years in prison for vehicular homicide. But after the Spanish government negotiated Caramero's release, he gave an interview to the Washington Post in which he said that their car was rammed from behind by a vehicle bearing state license plates. 8 U.S. senators have called for an investigation of the crash by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, charging that Caramero's account has raised, quote, deeply troubling questions that Paya's car was deliberately targeted by the Cuban government officials well known for the harassment of Paya. Until now, the Cuban government has refused to cooperate with such an investigation. The stories of these 4 heroes bespeak a regime of extreme inhumanity and duplicity. Those who challenge its power risk paying the ultimate price and often do. This is the context in which today we honor Manuel Cuesta Morúa. I have known Manuel for a number of years. I can say without any doubt that he stands in the tradition of the Cuban heroes I have memorialized today, especially the tradition of Osvaldo Paya, who sought a peaceful path to democratic transition and reconciliation. Manuel's strategic vision is informed by a spirit of democratic unity and guided by fundamental democratic principles that existing opposition coalitions should find a way of working together even if they keep their separate identities, that it's important to welcome and support different strategies for advancing democracy, since one never knows what will provoke change, and all can do their part in the democratization process. That Cuban Democrats must not isolate themselves from the international community, but should try to build ties of dialogue and cooperation. That it's important to observe the politics of what is possible, which is the best way to move toward the politics of what is desirable, while also recognizing that the inevitability of gradualism does not obviate the need for mobilization and resistance to push the struggle forward. And finally, that supporting initiatives that emerge from within Cuba is the best way to come into close contact with the Cuban people. The Cuban people have a profound need for international solidarity, which they have not received because of all the political confusion and wrongheadedness engendered by Castroism. But their liberation must come from within, and so must the effort to find a balance between reconciliation and coming to terms with the terrible truth of the past nearly 6 decades. Now that relations between Cuba and the United States have been normalized, it's urgently important that relations be normalized between the Cuban people and their government. Many people have sacrificed and died to achieve that goal that is called democracy. And the number of Cubans who share this vision continues to grow. If they can hold together, the future is theirs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I want to associate myself completely with Dr. Gershman's rather eloquent declaration, reminding us, many of us who are Americans, that I think that this country was put on this earth not to open golf courses and sell rice, but to change the state of mankind in positive ways. And I am sure that we all are joined here together in that common purpose, although there may be some disagreements as to details. I want to start a pragmatic review of where we are with U.S. policy. And mine is coming from a point of view of a critic of what President Obama has done. For 50 years, the totalitarian regime in Havana has made it a binary choice. You can either engage the regime and the government and have normal relations with it, or you can engage 11 million Cuban people and strengthen their efforts, support their efforts for building a more independent and self-sufficient life where they make decisions in their own lives. That's a binary choice. Since Lyndon Johnson, no president until President Obama has chosen to engage the regime at the cost of the Cuban people. And I think even before President-elect Trump during the campaign said that he would get a better deal with Cuba, I think the Obama initiative has lost some momentum, some of the allure in the last 2 years. From the beginning, even some of the supporters of the initiative were mystified at what little the Obama administration negotiators asked for, let alone got, in exchange for what became a torrent of unilateral concessions on the regime, starting with the political recognition and then the steady pressure to do what they could in terms of lifting executive sanctions, changing regulations to facilitate commercial engagement of Cuba under the rules set by the Cuban regime. And in ensuing months, we've seen it bear very little fruit. Under the best of circumstances, it's important to remember that engaging the Cuban regime is a very difficult thing to do. The first priority of the Cuban Castro regime is survivability, survival. Second priority is survival. Third priority reinforces the first two priorities. And no amount of trying to apply leverage on these folks will make a substantial difference. And it's only been 2 years, but we've seen not only things not improve, but actually get worse, which is sort of predictable that would happen. The death of Fidel Castro does prove one thing, and that Castros are mortal, which does serve some purpose. Because there are some who think that nothing significant will change in Cuba as long as the Castros are running the place. If you looked at Cuba 2 years ago and thought that the U.S. embargo was a bigger problem than the totalitarian regime and the bankrupt socialist policies that are intractably advocated by the Castro regime, then you might have given some hope for the Obama policies to make change. And unfortunately, the problem is, and always has been, the regime's policies of controlling every aspect of the lives of the Cuban people. But let's see as a practical matter, where we're heading thus far. In terms of human rights and economic liberty, the policies achieved the impossible. It's made things worse for 11 million Cubans, in my opinion. You've seen stepped-up repression, some of which Carl Gershman just described, on human rights activists, on dissidents, on independent journalists. In 2010, the Cuban Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation, with which I think our guest is affiliated, recorded 2,000 human rights violations in a serious way. In 2016, we're headed to 10,000 such abuses by the regime. Worse yet, these dissidents have very little support. At a certain point, 10 years ago, there was a conscious effort of the U.S. administration, of our Eastern European friends. I saw Ambassador Martin Paulus from the Czech Republic here earlier. There was a concerted effort to keep the European Union and some of our allies honest when it came to helping the Cuban people, engaging the Cuban people. I had the honor of hosting Antonio Rodiles at the American Enterprise Institute several months ago, and he sadly reported that the U.S. Embassy has virtually abandoned the human rights activists, the independent journalists, the dissidents. They get very little support from any embassy, certainly a shadow of what it was before. So actually it's gotten worse. You've also seen on the economic side a crackdown on self-employed. The regime has indicated that it will issue no more licenses for self-employed people. The promised economic reforms that were supposed to come out of the Cuban Communist Party Congress did not come to fruition, were not materialized. As a matter of fact, and I think this speaks volumes about this, and this is a matter of public record. It's not an anecdote, it's not a rumor. Advocates of the U.S. opening, people who were supporting President Obama's opening, strongly urged him and some of his policy advisors not to go to Cuba until the Cuban Communist Party Congress met and issued some of the economic reforms and openings that they had hoped would be produced. Because these people, these Americans, Chamber of Commerce and others, earnestly engaging the Cuban policymakers and were hoping for some kind of opening that would give more economic power, economic liberty to individual Cubans. They urged repeatedly that the president should not make a trip to Havana. And finally, one of the State Department interlocutors broke down and told them, look, the president's going because his girls are going to be on spring break and he wants to take them to Cuba. Again, it's a matter of public record, and I had it confirmed by two individuals separately who were actually supporting the president's policy and were dismayed by that decision. And so Congress produced, the Communist Party Congress produced no significant changes. On economic engagement, there's been lots of fanfare, lots of pressure, lots of trips, a lot of sizzle, but very little steak, and even less now. As friends of mine have come back, the executives from other companies, saying they looked for opportunities, and frankly, the risks outweigh the rewards by far, as long as there's a country without the rule of law. I could have told them that, saved them the airfare, but they couldn't necessarily have gotten their picture taken with President Obama or with Penny Pritzker, the Commerce Secretary, whose own Hyatt company, owned by her family, has refused to do business in Cuba, while she and the rest of the administration are forcing other hotel chains to go into Cuba and do business with the Cuban regime, to manage hotels owned by the Cuban military, which dominates the tourism industry. American Airlines just announced today that they're already, by the way, their service, regular service, which started five days ago, I understand, they're already cutting back on service. for lack of demand to some of the secondary cities on the island. Deals that have been licensed by the U.S. government expressly authorize the participation in deals with Cuban government entities. Of course, it's natural because there's no other independent entity to do business on the island, and particularly with entities controlled by the Cuban military, dominated by the Castro family. One of the flagship deals, much ballyhooed, was the idea of building tractors. An Alabama company was going to manufacture tractors on the island, 1940s era tractors, which the regime found to be not prestigious or sophisticated enough, so they killed the deal about 10 days ago. So this was, in all the newspapers, this was going to be a big thing. First thing, Cuban government killed it, which I guess they looked down on the 1940s era tractors, which is interesting since their sugar harvest is at 1920s level. So the 40s would have been an advancement for the revolution. So that, the other very important part of this whole push to engage in an economic way is that it's also reported in the media, the gatekeeper for these deals is a man named Luis Alberto Rodriguez, a general of the army in Cuba, the son-in-law of Raul. So in point of fact, rather than advance in any way progress toward popular rule, the engagement has enforced a dynastic transition. And I'm going to stop there. I haven't gone quite 10 minutes, but I don't want to dominate all the conversation but I do think, and I'm prepared to talk a little bit about what President-elect Trump might do, from essentially rolling back all of the changes or looking for ways to get a better deal.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now go to Professor Richard Feinberg, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Really, it's an honor to be here with Manuel, also with my colleagues for over many, many years, both Roger and Carl. And it's wonderful to be back here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which actually supported some of my own research on Cuba over various summers over the last 4 or 5 years. Cindy Arnson runs a great program here in the Latin America. I know she's traveling right now, but in the Latin American department, and I honor all of that work. We're at a very particular moment in not just U.S.-Cuban relations, but in American politics. The U.S. has been a beacon of human rights and democracy, and certainly that's what this award is about. As our domestic politics over the decades has had its ups and downs, but now we perhaps face the greatest challenge to our democratic institutions and ideals since the Civil War, I would say. As Manuel emphasized in his own remarks, global authoritarianism has placed modernity in danger, to quote him. Our recent exercise in public choice raises big questions about liberal democracy in a world of electronic communications and complex issues in a rapidly globalizing world poorly understood by an ill-prepared and easily distracted electorate. I suggest we now need a period of contemplation and humility is in order, and that in terms of promotion of democracy abroad, we here in Washington may have to take a lower profile for a while. Carl, I think this is particularly challenging for agencies that are tasked, after all, with democracy promotion, but in a country that has just elected an individual who has championed values associated internationally with authoritarian traditions. This is posing a big test to the fortitude of democratic institutions and norms here, above all, in Washington. I live in California now, far away, but I come to Washington and I find a city in shock, and a city awaiting occupation by alien forces. I can tell you California is in a state of semi-insurrection already. Our political authorities have said they will not enforce certain anti-immigration measures that have been threatened if they are taken. Our authorities have said they will not enforce certain counter-narcotics policies if the federal authorities attempt to enforce them. This is a form of semi-insurrection already. So I think we are possibly in for some very, very different times here in the United States. Therefore, I think we have to be humble when we approach the international area. We also have to be humble about our understanding of the interactions between external pressures, say from the U.S., and the internal politics of other countries, say such as Cuba. That in fact these linkages, and here I'm sounding sort of like an academic, these linkages are not often well understood, and the results, the consequences, may not have been intended. And here I get to those who may be advocating a renewal of the pre-2009 tough sanctions. If those that advocate that, it seems to me they have the responsibility to explain the logic of the causality of what they hope to accomplish. What exactly are the agents of change that will be empowered? And what are their capabilities? And what would peaceful change, which Manuel emphasized, what would peaceful change look like? We know that sanctions, from many, many studies, sanctions can only work under certain conditions. They must be fully multilateral, and they must be carefully targeted at specific goals. A success story of multilateral sanctions, after all, is the Iranian nuclear deal. But in the case of Cuba, many, many decades of economic sanctions have not worked. One, because they haven't been multilateral. It's been a self-U.S. embargo of ourselves. Cuba's open to the rest of the world in terms of economic investment and commerce. And if the goal is in effect not a finite goal, but rather regime overthrow, but that such policies lack a clear chain of causality, then it seems to me we're off on the wrong track. I would also ask, is it in the interest of the United States to promote regime collapse, that is to say a possible civil war on the island, which likely could promote bloodshed and a massive emigration crisis? Quite possibly at the very end of that chain of action and reaction, resulting once again in U.S. military intervention? Is that the goal? I can tell you from my own period in government, that is the Pentagon's worst nightmare, which is why the Pentagon has always been an advocate for caution and stability in the Caribbean in general. It seems to me, rather than apparently trying to promote regime collapse and possible mass conflict on the island, rather, the values advocated here today by Manuel: tolerance, peaceful change, pluralism, political pluralism, self-control, rationality. Carl's emphasis on gradualism, I would completely endorse. Now here, I'm not a member of the current administration, but I do associate myself, by and large, with the policies of the Obama administration. What I think the inside of the Obama administration was to connect certain dots. He saw the link between travel, remittances by Cuban Americans, and the creation of an emerging private sector in Cuba. Now, the government of Cuba has authorized 500,000 cuentapropistas, self-employed, but I count in my book, am I allowed a little moment of self-promotion and commerce here? Open for Business, Building the New Cuban Economy, published by Brookings.
This is mine.
But it is yours, sir. Yes, sir. I'm not taking it back. Thank you very much for your possessiveness. As many as 2 million out of a workforce of 5 million in Cuba have at least 1 foot in an emergent private sector. There have been many other changes as well. You have many people have attitudes of middle classes in Cuba. There's much more information flow. Manuel emphasized the paquete, which after all, although maybe it was in a gray area, but tolerated by the authorities. More and more Cubans have digital devices of all sorts. There are, in fact, non-state-owned blogs and other forms of internet communications now available on the island. There's much more expression. Your average Cuban is much more willing to express themselves and criticize the government today than was the case, let's say, 5 years ago. And I can attest to this because I visited the island over this period of time, and I can see the change. Frankly, I think those who say nothing has happened, or in fact it's going in reverse, with all due respect, Roger, I think that's misinformed. What Obama's strategy was about, it wasn't so much bargaining, we'll do this if you do that, which hasn't produced results over many decades with the Cubans government, but rather it's a structural analysis, that you support the private sector, you support openness, you support more international travel, you support, even if it's investment, not so much from the U.S., but with other countries. That gradually produces a more pluralist economy, and although I think we shouldn't be overly deterministic, a more pluralistic economy is likely to lead towards a more pluralistic politics. That's the long-term bet of the Obama administration. That is, in general, the way U.S. foreign policy operates. This is not a theory invented for Cuba. This sort of structural approach is what U.S. foreign policy has operated on worldwide for many decades, in fact. The other thing that Obama did was he deprived the Cuban government of its national security paradigm, which was all about an imminent external threat, justifying so many measures. And if you don't mind, Honoree, I will quote some of your own words in this regard. You wrote in 2015, "Revolution with an enemy, question mark," and I'm quoting with liberal translation. "In Miami, they don't understand that the invented enemy was the enemy necessary to impede a democratic debate on the island. Now, and in fact, Havana lacks a narrative for times of peace. The destruction by the Obama administration of the narrative of the Cuban government is such that it doesn't know how to respond to this dilemma. In fact, until yesterday, before Obama, the Cuban democratic community was the enemy because it was allegedly the friend of the principal enemy. What must happen now when relations are normalized between two enemy states? Wouldn't it be logical now to open up a process of normalization between the state of Cuba and Cuban society?" Did I have it roughly correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So those who would return U.S. foreign policy to the status quo ante, what it was pre-2009, a policy, frankly, which I think is based more on emotions of vengeance for what was lost 2 generations ago. That's not a pragmatic assessment of either the realities on the island or the nature of U.S.-Cuban relations. For my book, can you hold it up again? Go ahead. Yeah, thank you. He's advertising my book. Thank you so much, Manuel. I interviewed a lot of millennials on the island. By the way, something I probably couldn't have done 5, certainly 10 years ago. And they were willing to appear in this book with pictures taken. And these are, I found some millennials, of course, who are still on the island, but these are all people well-educated, professionals who could leave. They could all find employment abroad, I think. They're bright, well-educated, ambitious. They've chosen to stay because they believe that the future of Cuba will eventually, within 10 years, be a more normal future. And what does that normality mean? It means they will be able to pursue their talents and professional goals and ambitions on the island. More normal means they will be able to travel abroad. If you're working in audiovisual production, for example, you can live in Havana, get on a plane, fly to Hollywood, spend a few weeks there working on a project, and return to your family back on the island. That also normality, although we can't predict exactly what the politics would look like, it would certainly be a more decentralized politics, which is code for we know what that means, a more decentralized politics, a more normal politics, a more pluralistic politics. That was the anticipation of every single millennial that I interviewed. And every single one was 100% in favor of the normalization of relations that had occurred between the Obama administration and the government in Cuba for the very reasons that Manuel, I think, emphasized. So, my last point looking forward, and Roger started to talk about this, and let's see if he agrees with me or not, that there could be a deal that could serve both the interests of the United States and the interests of the Cuban people. And I'll just throw out some elements of a deal that I think is in line with what so far President-elect has suggested and some of his senior people. Okay. Yeah, that's not part of the explicit deal. I'm not going to comment on what might be discussed behind closed doors. All right, several elements of what might be a deal that would advance the interests of both parties and could be presented. Of course, the presentation would have to be done carefully because of the political sensitivities of these issues in both governments and countries. Agreement on counterterrorism, which looks like the centerpiece of the administration coming in, seems to be. The Cubans, as we know, are opposed to terrorism. Now, there can be some debates on this issue, but essentially, that's been their longstanding position. So why not reach an agreement? We already have memorandums of understanding on aspects of law enforcement, counter-narcotics. We could really, counter-terrorist agreement. Second, this administration, Republican presumably, will put a great interest on property rights and property claims. There are $2 billion worth of U.S. property claims. There already have been discussions, 2 meetings. The Cubans accept the principle of compensation for nationalized property. Therefore, it's just a matter of putting some numbers on it. Agreement on property claims. 3, religious freedom, emphasized by some senior folks from the Trump team. 3 popes, Catholic popes, have visited the island. Evangelicals are very, very active. If you walk around the streets of Havana or any of the other major cities on the weekend, you hear the chants, the songs of the evangelicals pouring out into the streets from their churches. And there are several synagogues that are wide open in Havana as well, and whose buildings are in much better shape than most government buildings. Possible agreement on political prisoners and on fugitives, details, but sure, why not? And finally, on opening markets. The Cubans have moved in this direction. There has been some progress, Roger, certainly not as much as there needs to be, and as I emphasize in my book, but openness to both domestic and international investment and commerce. So that's a lot of issues. Those are a lot of issues. So if there could be a deal around those sets of issues, I think we could then have movement towards continued normalized relations in the interest of both countries. We have hope on that basis for a dialogue and a situation in which rationality prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Feinberg. Thank you. This panel demonstrates that the Wilson Center's ability to bring together very different perspectives on important, sensitive policy issues. We want to engage in a discussion now. I want to give the panelists a chance to respond to each other, but also bring you into that conversation. But first, Manuel, an opportunity to respond to some of these ideas and thoughts, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to comment, and then involve all of you. Manuel, you can speak in either Spanish or
Okay. I'll speak Spanish first. Yeah. Sí, bueno, primero que todo no, ya estuve primero ahí, así que a continuación agradecerle a Carl, no que me haya vinculado a héroes en Cuba, sino que los haya recordado, porque es importante para los luchadores por la democracia. Fueron gente que a lo largo de muchos años perdieron su vida justamente por las ideas democráticas. Y eso es algo que merece honor y respeto, así que le agradezco mucho a Carl que lo haya mencionado. En segundo lugar, yo voy a ser breve en referencias políticas más concretas, porque me parece más importante la conversación. y voy a pasar rápido por algunos puntos. En primer lugar, este es el tipo de espacio que quisiéramos en Cuba, ¿no? Que hubieran opiniones diversas. Desafortunadamente no lo tenemos todavía. Y ese es el punto fuerte del amigo Roger Noriega. No tenemos un espacio diverso para el debate de ideas diversas en Cuba. Y es importante puntualizar eso. A continuación, me gustaría enfocar solo dos temas. Primero, el cambio de política de los Estados Unidos hacia Cuba. A mí me parecerá muy importante por lo siguiente. Es la diferencia que hay entre un gobierno que duerme tranquilo y un gobierno que no duerme de ninguna manera. Con la anterior política, el gobierno cubano dormía muy tranquilo. Absolutamente tranquilo. Por varias razones. Una de las básicas que ha sido mencionada acá es que el embargo era unilateral. Las causas fundamentales por las que el gobierno cubano no podía comerciar no tenían que ver con el embargo. Tenían que ver con que no tenía dinero para comerciar. De hecho, pidió mucho dinero prestado que el Club de París le perdonó como prueba efectiva de que podía comerciar. Pero era un modelo que no funcionaba. Pero dormía tranquilo con el embargo. Porque la naturaleza del régimen es la naturaleza que refleja la política del embargo. Vivir en guerra fría. Digamos que la guerra fría es un modo de vida de la revolución cubana. Por eso el cambio de política me pareció importante. Con ese cambio de política, el gobierno no duerme tranquilo. Razón por la cual la nueva retórica del gobierno es atacar justamente lo que el gobierno quería. Un intercambio normal entre los Estados Unidos y Cuba. ¿Cómo se supone que va a haber un intercambio normal entre una nación como los Estados Unidos, abierta, plural, defensora de las libertades, y una nación como la cubana? El único mensaje de ese intercambio de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba es justamente el mensaje de la libertad que el gobierno cubano temía. Por eso los que siguieron el discurso de Obama en La Habana recordarán, los que siguieron, digamos, el aftermath del discurso, no el discurso mismo, recordarán que terminando Obama su discurso en La Habana, rápidamente el régimen abrió las cortinas a sus defensores dentro de la isla para hacer lo primero que saben hacer, que es tratar de destruir el discurso, el efecto del discurso de Obama en La Habana. Y este es el cambio. Otro punto, y aquí termino de verdad, es que ciertamente la política del gobierno cubano hacia los derechos humanos no tenía que ver con los Estados Unidos. Tiene que ver con su propia naturaleza. La pregunta que todos nos hacíamos es si era más importante que el gobierno cubano dejara clara su propia naturaleza sin una coartada fuerte frente a la comunidad internacional, que era precisamente la hostilidad de los Estados Unidos. Mientras la hostilidad de los Estados Unidos, la falta de relación política, de normalización entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos existía, el pretexto de la represión en Cuba era justamente la política norteamericana. Ahora sale con toda su naturaleza y con toda su fuerza cuál es la verdadera naturaleza de la represión. Por eso, a nuestro modo de ver, una de las cosas clave en el cambio de política de los Estados Unidos hacia Cuba no tiene que ver necesariamente con que se abren o no empresas. Tiene que ver con la eliminación de la coartada, que el profesor llamado de seguridad nacional, pero para nosotros la entendemos como algo más fuerte que la seguridad nacional, que es la coartada nacionalista del régimen para suprimir toda diversidad al interior de la isla. Eliminada esa coartada, todo lo demás queda por una efectiva solidaridad de la comunidad internacional con activistas y movimientos prodemocráticos que van a seguir siendo reprimidos. Termino aquí.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. I'd like to give the panelists a chance to respond.
Can I jump in?
Ambassador? Sure.
Sure. I understand that that the regime spends a lot of its time, rhetorically and otherwise, a lot of its resources suggesting that the U.S. embargo is the cause of all of the people's problems. But I've met so many Cubans, and I've met another one this afternoon, who doesn't believe that, who's never believed that, who believes that the true nature of the regime is the root of the problems, the economic problems that they confront. So perhaps the president's opening with all of the unilateral concessions has allowed him to make that argument that the United States is not the problem, is not going to be an excuse to his friends in Europe and Latin America. But if he can't then close the deal and get those people to do more to help the Cuban people, then it really doesn't have the kind of material impact that it could. And that's, I don't criticize the whole idea of trying something more creative by any means, but I don't think I don't think simply removing the argument from that the government has made up to now, blaming everything on the U.S. embargo, is worth the price that's been paid in terms of abandoning our essential principles on the defense of democracy and human rights. I'm waiting for somebody to blame the U.S. embargo on Venezuela for the complete and utter destruction of Venezuela in the last 18 years. But guess what? There isn't an embargo on Venezuela. It's a country right now that is essentially micromanaged by Cubans. So if we see a pattern there, I think there's a reason for that. Let me talk a little bit about where Trump might be headed. And I don't profess to be or want to be a policymaker in his administration. Certainly, they could consider a rollback of all the changes, a reimposition of all of the regulations that existed before, and even break diplomatic relations. Or I think they could take a more incremental approach. And by the way, we've seen, again, the example here that if you're not for what President Obama is doing, you're either for doing nothing or invading. I'm not advocating either of those things, and I never have with respect to Colombia or virtually anywhere else. I think that what's much more likely to happen is the Trump administration announcing a policy review. Certainly that's called for. Maybe with an eye to making substantial changes based on one measure. Is it good for the people or is it good for the regime? And yes, my friends, there is a distinct difference between those two things. We have to find a way to be much more creative in that regard. Different presidents, again, since Johnson, did find ways to be more creative. President Carter even tried to engage the regime, and President Clinton wanted to. But they were so I think there is something to be said for, challenging policymakers, challenging American civil society, challenging American business to be more creative in how we interact with the Cuban people. Maybe it's time to look at the Gustavo Arcos principles, modeled on the Sullivan principles, on how American business should do business with the island, respecting labor rights, respecting human rights, respecting environmental principles and protection of the environment as part in the way we engage. And that's well documented. The ARCOS principles have been around for 15 years. And so those of you who haven't read that, it would be, I think you find it a very interesting way of looking at this. In terms of diplomatic relations, maybe President Trump should designate Carl Gershman to be ambassador to Cuba. And challenge whether the government will accept the likes of Carl Gershman or Barbara Haig or one of the wonderful people that works at NED, and make full use of our diplomatic presence there to put 10 or 15 human rights officers and other activist officers on the ground and throughout the island, and see whether Cuba is prepared to accept the sort of thing that 140 countries accept all over the world in terms of our engagement with their people. I also think there is room to find a deal with congressional stakeholders across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, who give much higher priority to engagement of the Cuban people, because they bring two essential ingredients to this Cuba policy that is sort of missing: knowing and caring how it's going to impact the Cuban people. And as I mentioned before, challenge our European and Latin American friends to do more. I had lunch with 5 ambassadors on Friday, and one of them emphasized, very super nice, decent guy, emphasized that Latin America is completely convinced that President Obama's strategy on Cuba is correct, and any kind of rollback would be met with a serious response from the region, which is remarkable because the Latin American, Cuban, and Caribbean countries haven't done anything, haven't lifted a finger to help the Cuban people any more than they ever did in the last 2 years when President Obama removed this pretext for their inaction. They haven't done a thing. So what they risk doing now is demonstrating that their solidarity is with a Stalinist government in Havana, not with 11 million Cubans. So I think that President Trump could simply say, look, I'll keep things in place, I'll keep most of this policy in place, but I'd like to see our European and Latin American friends step up and do some things that vindicate what they claim to be their values.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Who would like to comment? Carl?
Well, okay, I know the debate here is between Richard and Roger. The NED is not a policy institution. We're bipartisan, as you know, and we've managed, I think, rather well dealing with a divisive issue like Cuba without getting into a divisive political debate, because we just don't get into the issues of embargo and so forth. But having said that, I think I do want to take issue with one point that Richard made. When he was talking about the what he called the structural analysis, and he said, "I don't mean to be deterministic, but," and then he, listed all the things that would be produced by a greater relationship. And I have to confess that I think Cuba is one country where conceivably that might work because of its proximity to the United States and the cultural affinity between the Cuban people and the American people. We both like baseball and music and what have you.
Laughing.
Huh? You love it?
Laughing.
Yeah.
And laughing.
And laughing, okay. It's not everybody does it as well as you do it. But I think the people who have that engagement policy, that engagement with a dictatorship economically will ultimately lead to political pluralism if you engage economically, should take a second look at that policy. China just glares at us all the time, and it's not just China. I disagree with you about Iran. We'll see what happens, but it's just not enough. And, we've had this experience over the last 25 years. We're very concerned about this at NED, that after the fall of communism in 1929, the dominant point of view was that the liberal world order is here to stay, and that the priority is to integrate the autocratic countries into the liberal world order, the WTO, and all of the different dimensions of the global economy. And that will lead to liberal change. And we've just published a book, which I call your attention to, Authoritarianism Goes Global, which has been widely circulated, which has a whole collection of essays about what's happened. And what's happened is that the autocratic countries took the invitation, came in, and they took it over, and they distorted it. And they're now actually trying to change the global norms that have been part of the liberal world order. And people are concerned even about the survival in the current period of the liberal world order. And these are norms in the area of human rights versus sovereignty, norms in the area of elections, in many, many different areas, information, and the use of soft power by these countries. And it just hasn't worked that integration and into the global economy leads to political liberalization. It might conceivably work in Cuba. It's possible. And if it's going to happen, it's because it'll be only because, in my view, the recommendations that Roger just made about Sullivan principles, Arcos principles, labor rights, should be followed rigorously. I mean, business is not going to go in unless there are changes in the rule of law in Cuba to make Cuba a more, inviting area for economic investment, and you don't have that yet in Cuba. But if they do go in, I think having something like that is very, very good. But without that leverage, without that pressure, don't assume automatically in a deterministic way that economic engagement to encourage economic pluralism in a certain way will also encourage political pluralism. And it might be quite the opposite, that they will tighten up more to protect their political structure, to resist the kind of pressures that might be introduced by economic changes. Just two other, very, very short points. I think that, when you call upon Ned to be more humble because the U.S. has problems, I'd like to know, Manuel, do you really want us to be more humble and to withdraw a little bit because we got some problems here?
No.
Or do you want us, or if indeed the U.S. withdraws from this field, do you want the Ned to be more vigorous and more outspoken in what it does?
That's right.
And this is exactly what we don't get, I don't feel guilty or somehow that we have to apologize for what we do. We support people like Manuel all over the world who believe in freedom and democracy, and it's our obligation. And if the democratic world is in trouble, and it's not just the United States, it means that we just have to work harder, and we have to work on the problems in our own country. The Net is not a grant-making institution in the United States, but we are publishing articles in our journal about the declining support for liberal democracy among our young people. Follow these articles. I mean, it's really, really troubling, and we have to stimulate people in the United States to undertake greater education programs to really reach young people who are now tending towards supporting strongmen more than ever before. This is the articles by Foa and Monk in the July issue, and there's a New York Times last week ran a big article about the one that's coming out in the January issue. So this is really, really important. And lastly, Richard, you spoke when you said something to the effect about Washington is in shock. Well, part of Washington is in shock. The question is, who do you talk to?
My friends.
You probably talk to the same people in Washington you speak to in Cuba. I mean, there are diverse points of view. And there are diverse points of view in Cuba. I think it's probably fair to say, Emmanuel will be able to speak to this, better than any of us, that the Cuban people probably, very likely don't want a tumultuous change. They want stable change. And there has to be a kind of, to get the support of the Cuban people for the process of change. I don't think they like the government, but they want a process of stable change. And I think that's what has to happen. But I think, the kind of attitudes I talked about in my remarks about someone like Lauro Payan, I mean, think about what we're dealing with here. This is not a normal government. This is a government that murdered the Cuban equivalent of Andrei Sakharov in Osvaldo Paya. They murdered him. I mean, I'm going to say that openly, even though there's no proof. I mean, there should be an investigation, and they probably murdered Lauro Payan as well. These are heroic, marvelous people, and they were killed by the regime. Think about that. That's what we're dealing with here. And and how you pressure for that kind of change is not easy, but it's not going to happen just because we unleash some structural forces. It's going to take an awful lot of speaking about these issues, speaking honestly about these issues, ending the double standard that exists on Cuba, where that a right-wing dictatorship would never get away with in a million years. Ending the double standard in the United States, in Latin America, in Europe, to begin to build coalitions of solidarity with the Cuban people, and to be able to explain to people what happens on the island there. And maybe as it opens up a little bit, we'll be able to do that a little bit more.
Thank you, Carl, for these thoughtful points.
Okay,
Richard,
well,
yep.
first let me congratulate the Woodrow Wilson Center for putting on such an entertaining and pluralistic panel, and I enjoy the give and take, and I certainly respect the different points of view around the table. Of course, I agree with Roger that the root of the economic problems in Cuba are primarily the economic system in Cuba itself, and that's a point that my book, Open for Business, drives home with lots of evidence and statistics, etc. Thank you. You're the man. All right. Yes, good man. What a nice panel. What a nice panel. What a nice panel. I also like the fact that Roger said, yes, it was time for something more creative, if I can. And Carl did seem to grant that the structural analysis, yes, it's worrisome what's going on in China right now, but Cuba is not China. And as you pointed out, I think a structural approach in the Caribbean, Cuba being surrounded by a sea of democracies, after all, the probabilities of that causality are that much higher. On the argument that a Trump policy might be based upon some sort of principle, as Roger said, what's good for the people. Well, tourism, for example, or travel, if I can one more time pump a recent study, this I put out at Brookings just on Friday. It's called Tourism in Cuba, Riding the Wave Towards Sustainable Prosperity. And we have numbers in here which show that most of the dollars spent by visitors in Cuba do not go into the pocket of the Cuban military, as some people assert. I'm not going to say none of it, but most of it does not. In fact, it goes to the workers in the hotels, to the farmers who provide the food, et cetera, and the numbers are all there. So I think a strong argument could be made. In any society, of course, it's hard to untangle these issues, as we know. Congressional legislation says it's okay to provide foreign assistance in authoritarian states if they go to the people. And people at the Treasury Department, put a lot of effort into try to figure this out in a case-by-case basis. We know it's difficult. But I think the argument in here is most of the money that American tourists are spending in Cuba today gets into the hands of the Cuban people and is for the good of the Cuban people. And if that were the analysis, then we would continue with this piece of the policy. On some idea of Sullivan principles, I actually have advocated something like that in previous publications on Cuba, talking not in terms of Sullivan principles so much per se, but as corporate responsibility, which is very much related. Now, the only way you can actually have the U.S. trying to enforce Sullivan-like principles in Cuba or anywhere else is if you have U.S. investment. Only then do you have the vehicle for advocating for companies doing the right thing with regard to their employees, the environment, and the community, which is the essence of corporate responsibility. So I think we could find some agreement there as well. I'm looking for areas of convergence among us here on the panel. And the idea of more Latin American and European engagement, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree 100%. But I also agree with your point that, of course, if you talk to the average Latin American diplomat, they're not, Cuba is not the top of their agenda. They have their own national interest to pursue. But it still remains an issue when it's front and center and when they're in the room together, as we saw at the various Summit of the Americas when they pushed hard on the issue. So that's, on the one hand, engage them positively, but on the other hand, if we were to really revert back entirely to the pre-2009 policies, that would, once again, inject a thorn into U.S.-Latin American relations. And this is my very last point. An incoming administration, if it carries through on its deportation policies, if it carries through on its, we're walking away from various trade agreements, we're ripping up NAFTA, we're walking away from Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera. So we would be in a situation of seriously tense relations between our hemispheric partners on two critical issues, movements of people and movements of goods. And if we add to that putting taxes on products produced by American companies overseas, then we're on the opposite side of movement of capital, labor, and goods. So across the board, we'd be in conflict with our Latin American neighbors, as we've never been in our 200 years of history. I mean, we could be entering into a period of uniquely tense relations. Throw on top of that Cuba, and you've got really an unprecedented situation of tension in inter-American relations, should, in fact, the administration follow through on some of its early propositions. So let's hope that all of that's avoided.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your remarks, and I appreciate the panelists' willingness to engage with each other in a thoughtful way and maybe even to chart out some areas of agreement. Now, I want to open it up to for all of you. If you could please, as I mentioned at the earlier session, wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation if you like. I'll be trying to get in as many of you into the discussion as possible. We'll start over here, and I'll work my way around the room.
My name is David Crocker. I'm at the University of Maryland in the School of Public Policy. I share the uneasiness with the economic determinism argument, and yet I would like to see whatever Ned does in the future or other external agents to be sensitive to Manuel's view that it's finally up to the Cuban people and self-determination coming from the island itself. So I'd like to ask Manuel, what political changes are being explored or considered by democratic forces within the island itself, whether above ground or not?
Thank you.
Digamos que en los últimos tiempos se viene recuperando una tradición que inauguró Osvaldo Payá Salinas, que es la de intentar empujar el proceso de democratización desde las instituciones existentes. La visión que básicamente hemos tenido a lo largo de muchos años, de que estamos frente, la visión que no es incorrecta conceptualmente, de que estamos frente a un poder totalitario que debe ser movido rápidamente, en un minuto, no nos permitió ver las opciones que ese mismo poder totalitario estaba obligado a narrar, justo porque estaba en una época donde se hablaba de democracia y se hablaba de respeto a la ciudadanía. Osvaldo Payá tuvo la visión de decir, aquí hay unas brechas que nos permiten a nosotros abrir el juego político. La respuesta fue la que sabemos, o probablemente no todos sepan. Pero el hecho mismo de esa respuesta indicaba que el juego estaba abierto todavía. De modo que, pasado el tiempo natural, después de la dura respuesta del régimen, encarceló a 75 personas, metió miedo a la sociedad. Muchos hemos pensado en que se debe recuperar ese espacio y esa estrategia de cambio desde las instituciones. Y una de las estrategias que estamos empujando es una que se llama Otro 18. ¿Por qué otro 18? Porque hay una conjunción de circunstancias en el 2018 que son importantes. Y que parece van a ser más importantes después que murió Fidel Castro. La primera es que dice Raúl Castro, y yo digo solo dice, que se retira en el 2018. Y eso es importante. La segunda es que él dijo en algún momento que ese retiro iba a ser a través de una nueva ley electoral. Otra circunstancia importante. Y la tercera, que en ese momento coincide justamente que en Cuba hay un proceso que muchos llaman, con mucha razón, un proceso de votación plebiscitaria. Bueno, nosotros hemos creído que ese momento se puede utilizar para, y esto es importante, abrir el juego democrático desde abajo. Y nosotros insistimos en que abrir el juego democrático no significa que en el 2018 vamos a tener ya Estado de Derecho, respeto a las libertades fundamentales, es decir, el milagro cubano. Solo significa que intentamos abrir el juego desde abajo. Y esta iniciativa de Otro 18 corre junto a otras iniciativas de otras organizaciones que también se plantean lo mismo. Que por razones muy largas de contar aquí, no comparten completamente la estrategia que estamos siguiendo, pero sí un punto básico: abrir el juego desde abajo. Y en eso estamos trabajando y creo que es una buena oportunidad para el apoyo de la comunidad internacional.
Thank you. Lady at the end of the table there.
Ziep Trin, American University. Mr. Noriega, I'd like to ask you specifically to answer to the point to the following questions. First, given your critic hair-splitting statements, what offers do you have on the negotiating table? Second, in terms of realpolitik, beside and beyond human rights and democracy, what is United States' strategic goal in normalizing relations with Cuba?
Well, the policy of the United States, even today, because President Obama hasn't been able to derogate a public law with the stroke of a pen, is to condition normal economic and political relations with Cuba on very reasonable set of standards. This policy was approved by 3/4 votes in both houses of the U.S. Congress and approved by President Clinton. The dirty little secret in this debate, when you look at the labor rights standards, human rights standards, some kind of commitment to elections, some kind of verbal commitment to elections, freeing of political prisoners, allowing humanitarian supplies to be distributed freely. Every country, let me flip that around. Cuba is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that can't meet any of these standards. We're not talking about some minor differences. This is an anomaly on a pretty grand scale because of that's the way the government wants it. No other reason. Certainly that's not the way 11 million Cubans want it. That's the way the government wants it. So that's the strategy, is that you support civil society, support independent voices on the island. In material ways, there are some that are willing to run that risk. Certainly getting other countries to to engage the people and give them space to have a debate, to support them the way we are by having our guest here on this panel to have his views known and share them, these reasonable views with the people here in our civil society, and and replicate this all over the world so that people understand the reality of what's going on in the island and understand that you're not going to see this regime under these circumstances without any sort of pressure relent in any meaningful way. So what do we put on the table? It's normal economic and political relations with the United States, which is, it is not an immutable international principle that every country in the world has a right to do business with the United States. I mean, that, as a matter of fact, is governed not only by U.S. public law, by the World Trade Organization. The reality is, if Cuba were to do all of these things, if they were to meet these conditions, and by the way, if there were a post-Castro government committed to bringing about free elections, freeing political prisoners, taking steps to dismantle the police state, and making commitments to holding free elections, we could even provide economic assistance, let alone normal trade. We could provide economic assistance under current U.S. law. It's not that unreasonable. But even after it were to make these conditions under the World Trade Organization rules, there would be intense negotiation with whoever's calling the shots in Cuba over their labor rights, over the rule of law, over currency exchange, all of these things, far more intrusive, because every country in the world plays by those rules. And so I don't think it's that radical to suggest that Cuba should have to play by those rules as well.
Thank you. The gentleman here, and then we'll go over there. Please wait for the microphone.
My name is Roger Betancourt. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Maryland. I also happen to be Cuban by birth. I'm going to make a somewhat academic point, being an academician. There is a profound lack of ignorance of reality in a lot of the policy discussions. I'm going to give 3 examples, one for Manuel, one for Richard, and one for Roger Noriega. Carl gets a pass because I thought he was wonderful. So
To say, though.
the first general point is in Manuel's work, which I didn't know until today, I must confess, and is the fact that the liberal liberal democracy view does not give the right to anybody that wins an election to undo the fundamental principles of democracy. And both in the United States and everywhere else, a lot of people have been pushing the idea that whoever wins the election has a mandate. And that has been done under Democratic administrations, and now everybody's worried that Trump is going to do the same thing. I think that Manuel's work suggests that maybe we should discuss what the limits of the mandate of democratic elections in general are. That's point number 1 for Manuel to address. Second, with respect to the structural analysis, Richard's analysis, one of my areas is political economy. And it takes a very cynical view of what politicians do. And I find it surprising that there's no mention in Richard's structural analysis of the fact that maybe this policy toward Cuba, in addition to this long-term view, was also motivated by Obama's desire to win in Florida when he was up for re-election in 2012, and provide similar support in the current one for Hillary. He was more successful the first time than the second one. So that's one, that's the second point about this lack of discussion of real things that affect real events that we tend to be too polite to discuss. And then the last one for Roger Noriega is all this talk about embargoes ignores the fact that the Cuban embargo has had 3 dimensions. Trades in goods and services, which is the one that everybody seems to obsess about, which, as Richard said, it doesn't matter, it really doesn't work because Cuba has been trading with everybody else but the US, and so lifting it doesn't do much. But there are 2 other embargoes that people don't talk about. One embargo is the embargo on flows of persons, which in the case of Cuba has been completely lifted, especially from the flow of Cubans coming here. There was a migration accord signed by the Clinton administration that allows Cuba to have a minimum of 20,000 people coming as permanent residents every year. The diversity visas that are granted by the US for the rest of the world, which are granted on the same basis as these are granted, is 40,000 per year. So Cubans have the benefit, agreed by the Cuban government, of sending 333 more persons per capita than any other country in the world. And I have not seen anybody make that point. Finally, there is also the embargo on the flow of capital. And that one has not been lifted, but the description of a failure that Richard gave is totally inconsistent with that embargo. That embargo on the flow of capital, from a certain point of view, has been the most successful embargo in the world because, as it has been said, the European Union, Japan, Germany, the French, the Paris Club, even the Russians, they all forgave, they all have been lending money to Cuba, the US have not. They all had to forgive 80 to 90% of the debt. So if one of your objections is not to lend to people who won't pay you back, that's a really successful embargo.
All right, thank you. Manuel, do you want to?
Sí. Bueno, yo espero que no haya ningún periodista aquí que vaya a sacar un lead diciendo Cuesta Morúa quiere imponer límites a las elecciones libres. Ese no es mi caso. Para nada. Cuando pongo atención en el punto de las elecciones, lo hago no improvisadamente, sino porque hice una lectura de las elecciones que llevaron a Hamas al poder en Palestina. Y me pregunté si el sistema electoral, la democracia electoral, como me gustaría decir a los académicos, era tan abierta como para suicidarse a sí misma. De manera que, a partir de ese momento, he enfocado mi visión en que la democracia electoral, para hacerse fuerte, requiere de algo más. Eso se puede, lo llaman algunos democracia deliberativa, una especie de discusión ciudadana, permanente y sistemática. Otros le ponen otros nombres. No voy a academizar aquí frente a académicos que me pueden intimidar. Pero en todo caso, mi punto, y lo quiero enfatizar en el caso de Cuba, es que un énfasis inclusivo en la democracia electoral puede llevar al poder a gente que suspenda para siempre la democracia electoral. Y el ejemplo mejor lo tenemos en Venezuela. Ahora tenemos un gran problema en la región, en las Américas, con uno de los países fundamentales, en el cual las elecciones solo han permitido construir no un proceso, sino un modelo para deslegitimar el valor de la democracia electoral. Por eso, no es que ponga límites a la democracia electoral, no es mi caso, sino que creo que para tener democracias fuertes hace falta también poner énfasis en cómo involucrar a la ciudadanía en una conversación permanente sobre sus problemas y sobre la democracia. Y eso quería dejarlo claro, aunque es mi responsabilidad tu interpretación.
Thank you. Ambassador, who else would like? Richard?
No, that's fine. Well, I will say that just in terms of the migration thing, I mean, that's a very interesting point. What's also interesting is that the number of people leaving the island illegally since President Obama introduced the changes has gone up, I think, threefold. You know, I don't think everybody's seeing things with such, you know, bright future ahead of them. I think some of it has to do with the concern that they may change the immigration laws here, and so people are trying to rush to get in while they can. But it does sort of speak volumes about, you know, what people's expectations are.
Dr.
on the
Gershman?
island.
Yeah,
And then we'll
I
go to
just
the
have
second.
2 points I want to make. First, just responding very briefly to Richard's point about tourism and the way the Cuban people get the money. It's my understanding, and I'd like Manuel to maybe either clarify this point, that in the tourist industry, people are hired if they have a buena presencia. In other words, if they're not Afro-Cuban. And the people who get the money are generally a smaller elite that have access to hard currency. And not the Cuban people, that you have to sort of make that distinction as to who can get jobs in the hard currency tourist industry. And related to that is, and this is not tourism, but when companies invest in Cuba, you have the dual currency system, which seems to me to be a problem that it urgently has to be solved. President Obama raised this issue in his speech in Cuba last March. And when a company invests in Cuba, that company cannot pay workers directly. A company pays the government in hard currency, and the government pays the worker in Cuban currency, and the difference is 25-1. So the Cuban worker is getting 4% of what is being invested. These are problems that have to be thought about, and that's not the result of you know, the U.S. embargo. But then to Manuel, Manuel, when you spoke of you know, your vision and the desire for a new electoral law, you know, we've talked a great deal about that. But it's my understanding that you know, you put forward an alternative electoral law in March, and I thought it was terrific. I wrote about it. And then Obama went to Cuba, and from what I understand, the Cuban government got all nervous that all of a sudden, you know, they may have opened up a box here that they were worried about what was coming out of it, and they tried to then shut it down immediately. And to my knowledge, they have not even proposed token changes to the electoral law. And the election that is coming up in 2018 is going to be a way of transferring power from one Castro generation to another Castro generation, which is a very serious problem. And that maybe you could elaborate. I was surprised you didn't mention it, that your approach now, given the fact that this process may be closed off, is to really focus on local elections.
Bueno, sí. Muy rápido. Ciertamente tendría que leer los trabajos de profesor Richard en relación con la posibilidad de que los cubanos sean los que más, es decir, el pueblo cubano sean los que más obtienen del turismo, básicamente, que es la idea. En todo caso, los números pueden hacer cambiar la perspectiva, suponen una investigación, pero en todo caso, la práctica fundamental que se puede observar cuando se va a Cuba es que, uno, el turismo después, según algunos estudiosos, después de la remesa, es lo que más dinero deja al régimen. Y segundo, que aquellos que están en las fronteras para obtener de alguna manera indirecta los recursos que provienen del turismo no son necesariamente las, digamos, las personas que están ligadas al trabajo más duro en las zonas turísticas. Si uno va a un hotel y lo toma como muestra de cómo funciona el mecanismo, se va a dar cuenta muy rápidamente de dos cosas. Primero, que la práctica de las propinas en ese hotel son colectivas. Es decir, si un trabajador se echa la propina en el bolsillo, puede ser luego separado del trabajo. Porque la obligación es que hay que poner, se dice tips en inglés, ¿no? Hay que ponerlo en una caja colectiva. De manera que hay un riesgo. Supuestamente es para distribuirla después de manera igualitaria, pero no se sabe quién controla. Lo segundo es que detrás de lo que podríamos estar definiendo como un capitalismo de amiguismo dentro de Cuba, los gerentes imponen también sus prácticas amiguistas al interior de la empresa hotelera. ¿Y qué supone esto? Supone que si usted no le paga al gerente o al manager, usted no le paga su parte de la propina que usted obtuvo, usted también puede ser separado. Porque se supone que el empleo que usted está teniendo en esa empresa fue resuelto por el manager. Esas son prácticas, digamos, corporativas que se están extendiendo en muchas de estas empresas. Pero, no obstante, me gustaría después ver los números y hablar un poquito más, con un poquito más de base.
But look, I'm not here to defend every practice in the Cuban tourism sector. I certainly agree that there's important reforms necessary, and all of my studies have said this very explicitly. The labor system needs massive reform. The foreign exchange system needs massive reform, obviously. But my question to you is, with all of these flaws and problems, and yes, in much of the hotel industry, whiter people are better positioned than poorer people. But with all of those flaws, would you then say the United States should cut off tourism?
No, por supuesto, no.
That's my point.
No estoy diciendo eso.
That's the point.
This is a black and white.
Thank you. That's the point.
No,
Go to this gentleman.
termino con lo siguiente, para responder a Carr. Ciertamente que el gobierno no haya hablado más de una nueva ley electoral no quiere decir que la vaya a presentar, que no la vaya a presentar. Quiere decir que le cogió miedo al proceso que desde la sociedad civil se empezó a construir, pero lo van a hacer en su momento. No obstante, me gustaría insistir en que para nosotros abrir el juego desde abajo, en Cuba, es lo fundamental, porque solo en la votación local es donde el elector está directamente vinculado a una posibilidad de elegir entre uno u otro. Donde único el elector puede decir voy a hacer un voto democrático es en el nivel local. Porque para impedir o evitar que la transición sea del castrismo a los demócratas, en los niveles superiores hay lo que se llama una comisión de candidatura que filtra, impide que cualquier otro elector, cualquier otro que se postule, pueda participar. Y esto tendría para nosotros una potencialidad muy fuerte si enviamos el mensaje que los electores donde único pueden votar están votando por las alternativas y no por el régimen. Eso sería un mensaje vigoroso. Y por eso, independientemente de que el régimen proponga o no una nueva ley electoral, vale la pena empezar a abrir el juego desde abajo en un proceso democrático.
Thank you.
Peter Humphrey, a former diplomat and current intel analyst. The answer to the realpolitik question is basically a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine. We do not want an opening Cuba to become a base for Hezbollah operations the way we see in Brazil and Paraguay. And we certainly don't want to see the Russians reopening the Lourdes intelligence base, which Putin has pretty much promised. So there has been a long history of stealth cooperative scientific research between Cuban scientists and American scientists. And it's not so much that the governments arranged this, it was kind of like the governments just didn't get around to objecting. So in fields like oceanography and biomedical science, there's even co-authorships of papers. This is something, if we're talking about things we could be doing with Cuba, that could be trebled or quadrupled easily. And the beauty of this is that scientists are not particularly jingoistic people. So if you're looking for the appropriate skeptics to be on your team and to work through and to work with, these are the people you want to go to. And it can be geophysics, it can be epidemiology, it can be meteorology, it can be all sorts of stuff. And so there's a huge program there that needs to be explored sooner rather than later.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and we have a reception waiting upstairs for us, along with an award ceremony, a small ceremony. Let's take just a couple of questions. I'll give the panel a final quick chance to respond to any question they'd like to. We won't get to all of them. Very short, quick questions. We'll start down here. This gentleman, there was somebody else.
Yeah, mine is pretty short. It's to Carl Gershman. And when Ambassador Noriega said Carl Gershman as a U.S. ambassador to Cuba, maybe I know that he was just put in as an example, but I think a lot of people are going to be very excited about that. Will you be open to serve?
Thank you. And the gentleman there, yes?
Yes, Mike Bossard, Department of State, retired. One aspect of the administration's Cuba policy that nobody has mentioned was the effort to increase the possibility for U.S. and perhaps other foreign telecommunications companies to become more active in Cuba, to enlarge the already considerable cell phone coverage in Cuba, and especially to get greater internet access. To me, this seems an absolutely crucial empowering element, potentially empowering element for the Cuban people that we should pay more attention to, and that the administration and the future administration should continue to support. Just any reactions from you?
Very good question. Yeah, and final.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz. It was mentioned that we have to work harder to support democracy, and that statement reminds me of a cartoon where there's a man spanking a baby and saying, "I'm going to keep spanking you till you stop crying." Sometimes working harder is not the answer, and you need to go working smarter. And doesn't working smarter require trying something new, and isn't that what's happening?
All right. I'd like to give the panel a chance.
I'm not an expert in spanking babies, but I will say that I said work more creatively, and I don't think there's anything creative about unilateral concessions. I'm sorry, I don't. Let's see, there was another point on telecommunications. I certainly think that is an area that should be explored. There are certain export restrictions that have to be observed and all that, considering all dual use and those sorts of things. But I think it's a very smart idea to try to open up. I don't think people realize that Cuba is probably down near North Korea in terms of access to the internet, and the substantial cost of wages to have access an hour of internet service. It's pretty obviously prohibitive. So I think those kinds of things make an awful lot of sense, and I think that we should encourage that.
Carl?
Oh, only to say that, you know, I think that what we do, and we're not part of the U.S. government, and we're not part of a policy debate. I don't even know what you're referring to. You're probably referring to the embargo, and just we're not involved in that. But I think that what we do, which is support for empowering civil society and working from the bottom up and try, I think that's very smart. If you got a better idea, I'd like to hear it.
All right, Richard?
Well, just finally to congratulate Manuel on his award. I think we all agree. I think there's been some agreement on this panel, some disagreement, but I think we agree on the value of creativity and looking for something new when old things haven't worked. I think there will be an announcement shortly by Google, actually, I understand, some agreement to begin to operate in the telecom space in Cuba, and that will be welcome, to be sure. And so, but finally, thanks very much to the Woodrow Wilson Center for arranging such a stimulating panel where we demonstrate the value of pluralism.
Thank you. Finally, Manuel?
Bueno, solo agradecerle que hayan tenido la paciencia de escuchar y de algún modo reconocer la importancia que tiene el debate, la discusión, la conversación, como le gustaría decir a un amigo. Y me gustaría invitarles a todos a las primeras elecciones democráticas en Cuba.
My thanks to the panelists, again, for engaging with each other, and for all of you for joining us. My thanks to the Ratiu Foundation that makes this event possible here at the Wilson Center. Congratulations to Manuel. We'll continue to celebrate upstairs. There will be a short award ceremony and Cuban food, is my understanding. Upstairs, 6th floor. Thank you.
Culinary celebration.
¿Cuánto tiempo va a estar?
A long time.
That's what I do.